Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first panel discussion of the conference. The theme of the discussion, evaluating teacher performance, has significant lessons for teacher education, and the discussion, we hope, will yield insights into what constitutes effective language teaching, and by extension, the characteristics of a successful language teacher. Broadly speaking, our four panelists will address three fundamental questions. Why should we evaluate teacher performance at all? How should we go about assessing teacher performance? Finally, what can we do with our findings and observations? The presentations will take into account the context in which in-service and pre-service teacher education programs are conducted. A word about the structure of this session. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, after which the audience can offer comments, seek clarifications, and ask questions. We have a distinguished team of panelists. Marianne Tudor-Craig, who's a consultant and trainer, education and international development. Mackenzie, senior training consultant, English Partnerships, British Council India, and a very familiar face in India in teacher training contexts. Hackett, coordinator of the TEC12 Special Interest Group for Testing, Evaluating, and Assessment, and project manager, Quality Assurance and Accreditation for English Language Services in Ireland. And Jane Massy, representing ABDI Limited, an organization based in Cambridge that specializes in assessment. The order of presentations will probably look like an inverted pyramid in the sense of the content. Jane will offer an institutional, broad perspective on teacher evaluation. Alan will probably talk about standards. Marianne, we think, will explore developmental issues. And Sue will address issues regarding teacher reflection and everything else that hasn't been mentioned. Thank you. Could I now ask Jane to start the discussion? Jane.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everybody. I was reading somewhere a few weeks ago that apparently there are only two things you ever need to know about a single topic. That every topic has just two things you need to know, and everything else is the application of those two things. Now, I have to say that sounds like a very slick marketing message, but I thought we might just apply it in this context. And to suggest to you two things that you must know about evaluation. The first of those two things is that if you don't know what you want to achieve and what you will be evaluating from the start, then you will fail to measure your results effectively. So the first thing you need to know is evaluation starts at the same time as the planning of any new project or program. It does not and should not come at the end. The second thing I think you need to know about evaluation is that transparency of data is essential. The information you collect has to be useful and usable, and most of all, available to everybody that is involved. If we're talking about teachers, colleges, trainers, parents, students, we need to make sure that the results that we get of every evaluation are available and open to everybody. Now, what I'm going to say is probably a bit controversial here, but one of our challenges is about evaluation, is that evaluation is not intended to tell you what you want to hear. Evaluation is not marketing. Now, that presents a real challenge when we look at results, and particularly at an institutional level. Let's firstly look at an institution such as a Ministry of Education. They fund a program, for example, in teacher training. They want to know whether that program has been a success. Well, firstly, we need to define right from the start of the program what success means, what outcomes did we intend to achieve. But secondly, we also need to know that the data that we collect in monitoring and evaluation will tell us whether that program is achieving the results, has achieved the results, and why it achieved the results. But we also need to know if it doesn't achieve results. Well, that's difficult. That's difficult because from an institutional point of view, it's going to be rather difficult to say to somebody, you've just spent so many millions of rupees and it hasn't achieved outcomes. That requires some really brave, courageous, and confident people. So that's the first thing I want to say from an institutional perspective. If we tell our institutions what we think they want to hear, we are failing in our duty to deliver outcomes. The second thing I want to say from an institutional perspective, whether we're talking about a university, a college, a school, a ministry, a donor, is that if you are funding a project or program, you are usually funding that program on the basis of an agreed number of outcomes you wish to see achieved. And they need to be measurable. Now, if, as is the case this morning, somebody in our session asked the question, what happens if you don't know what outcomes you will achieve? What happens if you haven't identified measurable impact outcomes from the start? How then can you evaluate? My answer to that is, if you don't know what you're going to achieve in terms of impact outcomes from the beginning, then you need to be having a different conversation at an institutional level. And that conversation is, we wish to carry out research, not we wish to have this program and project funded because we wish to achieve these outcomes. And I do think there is some, in my experience, we have seen many people who have used the opportunity to avail of funding, claimed they're going to achieve a set of outcomes, whereas in fact what they're doing is setting out a hypothesis that if they do something, they're hoping they might achieve a result, but they don't know what that result will be. These are two very different activities. So the third thing I want to say from an institutional perspective is evaluation, good evaluation, uses the tools and techniques of research, but it is not research. Research is carried out on the basis of a hypothesis. Evaluation is based on an assumption that you knew what you wanted to achieve from the start, and we are evaluating whether you have achieved it and how well and effectively you've achieved it. I also wanted just to add then, there is a difference in our definition between evaluation and assessment. Assessment, for example, of learning outcomes is the mechanisms you use, the way you approach finding out whether somebody learned something or not. It is not evaluation in itself, it is a part, and contributes, hopefully in a very rigorous and robust way, to the results you will collect for an evaluation. So the final thing I just want to say about evaluation from an institutional perspective is, when you're training your teachers, when you're teaching the young people and the citizens of today and tomorrow, you need to remember that there is a purpose in this. The purpose is not so that you can get them into the classroom and drum stuff into their heads. The purpose isn't solely that they acquire a level of knowledge or skill. There are much bigger pictures out there. We had an interesting debate at a workshop we ran in the last few days with somebody who came from a university, who came knowing that they need to improve the assessment of their learning outcomes of their students, and also that they needed to improve the curriculum of their student programs and improve their teacher performance. But the question was, why? The ultimate outcome has to be, for that institution, that those graduates gain employment. That's the impact outcome. Without the opportunity and the real evidence that they have taught those young people at university sufficiently well, both in life skills, technical skills, knowledge, and all the soft skills that people talk about these days, so that they will get a job in their chosen career, and in doing so, do a good job in that career. That's the impact outcome that needs to be at the mind of every teacher and every school principal and every university leader. We want to ensure we have citizens who behave in the highest way as good citizens, who have an opportunity to be employed and earn their income for life and to support their families. That's why we're doing this, and to improve our economies. So that's the institutional perspective. I'm sure it isn't always what everybody around the room necessarily feels, so I'll be more than happy to engage in a debate. But I'm also quite happy to pass this on to Alan, if he'd like to perhaps say, provide his expert input.
I was just wondering if anyone in the audience had any questions for Jane at the moment. Did that spur any thoughts in your minds, any questions that you would like to ask before I continue? Because I thought you explained that extremely well, and the only reason there are no questions is when somebody explains something extremely well, or you're totally confused by everything she said. But we do have a question over on the far side there.
Let's be very clear about this concept of an institution. I would like to be a little clear about that. Unless we treat a teacher training education institute, or we look at a national organization which takes care of training programs, or a private publishing house, or whoever. Give us how you perceive this notion of an institution.
I think you have, in many ways, and I know it probably wasn't intended as a rhetorical question, but I think you've answered the question yourself. The institution is the organization to which you belong. Now that might be a professional institution, and ultimately, of course, if you're a teacher, it may be your school, but that's part perhaps of a regional school network, and it may be ultimately part of the education systems. So I think the key thing here is when we talk about impact outcomes, the results of what we do, each of those institutions must be clear about what it intends as the impact outcomes from everything that it does.
Yeah, I was only worried when you talked about relating evaluation with research. You know, an institution or a set of institutions might be engaged in a certain evaluation which might involve a little bit of research, which in turn might involve a little bit of funding. It's possible to look at the roles of institutions from the point of view of coming out with results without maybe involving direct research, but or bringing in data from some other research. It is possible to look at it from both points of view, that research could be a part of evaluation.
I could not agree with you more.
Okay.
I think one of the challenges we face is that people who are commissioning projects, implementing programs, managing programs, assume they do not have a role in evaluation. And I would argue that is not the case and should not be the case. Now, in many instances, there is a requirement for expert research to support the work of the people who are running projects and programs on the ground. For example, we recently needed to understand what was it that caused young people to decide to join the army. This was in the UK. Now, when you're looking at recruitment, we needed to look at who did what and how and what was involved in that process. But we also needed to bring in researchers who are economists, who were able to do some economic research on this for us. So there is a role for research, but it is not the case that evaluation should be seen as an activity, a research activity. It includes research activities. It relies in some areas on researchers to provide specialist, maybe statistical expertise. But we have to widen the base to say that evaluation is the job of all of those who are delivering our programs, our projects, our systems.
IIM Ahmedabad had developed a questionnaire for students to judge a teacher. So what will be our practical step to judge a teacher? Am I clear to you?
We're going to come on to that. That wasn't really what Jane was talking about. We're starting from a bigger scale, and we'll work down to individual teacher assessment and evaluation later on in the panel discussion. So if you bear with us and be a little bit patient, and try and keep the questions connected directly to the topic that the speaker's talking about, and we'll deal with those issues later. And perhaps actually, to move on, this whole point of institutional involvement is interesting from my perspective, because in any of the projects that I work on, I'm dealing with more than one institutional perspective. I'm dealing with the British Council as an institution, but also the state government that I'm working with. And actually, the state government's perspective is the overriding one, because we're usually hired or work in partnership with them to help them meet their objectives in terms of teacher development and whole system renewal often. So just to give an overview of the kind of work that we do on the State Partnerships project as part of Project English, we work with around about 30 British Council hired training consultants who help us to train, at the moment, 4,266 teacher trainers across the country. Those 4,266 teacher trainers, in turn, have trained to date around about 700,000 teachers. So the scale of these projects is very large, and we need to ensure that there is quality education, quality development happening within those projects. We also need to make sure that the information that we gather and the information that we disseminate about those projects is transparent, that's available to not only the British Council management, to the state government officials, but also to the teacher trainers working on the programs and the teachers themselves. we have monitoring systems in place for each of those projects, so that when we talk to a state government, and usually when you talk to a state government, they come to us. We don't go to them. Usually a state government will come to us and say, we want our teachers trained. And we say, what would you like them trained in? They say, oh, something to make them better. Okay, so where do we start? And well, what we usually do is start by going out and looking at classrooms and finding out what the situation is on the ground, describe the picture of what is happening in the classrooms at that particular point in time. We take the results of that needs analysis and we go back to the state government and say, look, this is what we found. You say you want your teachers to teach better. We think this is what you mean. We think you want your learners, the learners that those teachers teach, to be able to communicate better in English, to be able to understand written texts better, to be able to write more understandable pieces of writing, to be able to use the language in a practical sense so that they will be employable in the future. Is that what you meant? And usually the answer is, yeah, that was something like what we meant. And can you teach them modern English methods? Teach them modern English language teaching methods. Not entirely sure what you mean. There's a very vague sense of where teachers need to be, what they need to do to be able to help their learners to be able to use the language in a practical sense. So the state government officials, and I apologize if there are any in the audience that recognize themselves in the description that I'm giving, state government officials often don't have a very clear picture of what the outcomes of their training is to be. They often only come to us with a budget that needs to be spent. Ah, you do recognize yourselves. And this is not only the government sector. This often happens in the private sector. It happens in the corporate sector. We want our employees to speak better English. Well, for what purpose? To what intended end? What is the way that they're going to use English in the workplace? Are we talking about increased grammatical accuracy, or is there some kind of functional component that they're not performing very well? Is there something on clarifying what somebody is saying, or is it about they're speaking too quickly and people don't understand them? What exactly is it that we need to help you with? And so we need to go talk to organizations about those needs, about their objectives, before we start designing any kind of intervention. And I'm not going to say a training course, because it doesn't have to be a training course. There are other alternatives out there. But to be able to design some kind of intervention that enables those people to achieve the outcomes that are set by the organization to meet those organizational objectives. So to be able to do that, we need to have a clear picture of what is happening now, what the situation is now, and what the ultimate goal is, what the ultimate objectives are, and what our outcome statements need to be. What are the outcomes for the learners and the people that are going through the intervention need to be. Only then can we start designing the intervention, whatever that may look like. And it could be a training course, it could be a CPD system, it might just be changing the timing of a course. An example we had earlier this week was that a university that has an English for Employability skills, or a preparation course for employability, in the first semester of the first year of their schooling. We suggested that it might be that if you're preparing them for employability and employment and passing an interview test, that that course might be better placed at the end of their learning, in the last semester, just before they take the interview test. Because if they have it in the beginning of a 3-year program and they're having their interview in the 3rd or 4th year, they'll have forgotten everything that happened in the first semester. So sometimes the intervention does not have to be a new training course, a new design. It might just be a matter of timing. You can also look at other forms of resource delivered through things like mobile phone technology, through digital technology. There are a vast number of ways that you can go about doing it. But to get back to the point of teacher evaluation and teacher assessment, once you've done some kind of intervention, whatever it is, and let's say it's a training course, you need to have a way of seeing whether the people who've gotten to the end of that course have actually achieved the learning outcomes set for that course. The learning outcomes are always set before the course is delivered, before the course is designed even. You set the learning outcomes, you design the course to meet those learning outcomes, then you deliver the course to enable the learners to achieve those learning outcomes. And the assessment component must be built into the design of that course from the start. That can be done in a number of different ways, and I think my colleagues are going to look at that later. If they don't, then we can deal with it through questions. But the important thing is, I think the most important thing at the beginning is having that vision of what you want the people to be able to achieve. Now, there's a handout circulating that gives you an example of what our attempt at describing a vision of what our teacher trainers need to be able to do at different points in their professional career. There's the heavy text side, and there's the light text side. There are 5 different heavy texts. One is subject knowledge, one is training room management, course and session planning, coaching and mentoring, and learning technologies. We looked at these as different subsets of skills that trainers need to be able to do, and things that they need to know to be able to do those things. And we built these into a description of what a trainer needs at different points in their career. Level 1 is novice level. Level 2 is experienced practitioner. Level 3 is mastery level, if you like. We can probably think of better names for them, but let's not argue about it. People who've been only just started doing the job, people who've been doing it for a while, and people who are very experienced in doing it. 3 levels there. For each of the subsections of the skill areas, we've tried to describe what the actions and the knowledge that person needs to be able to say, for us to be able to say they are at that level, they have achieved this level. The instructions on the back show you that we have used it as a self-assessment for recruiting our current training consultants and for use in the performance management system of those training consultants. We haven't yet used it with the state school trainers. So we're just developing this. We've developed this over the last couple of years, really, and we're looking at where to go with it next. But we use it for recruitment purposes, for example, when we have our people who apply for jobs with us look at this and assess themselves. If they can't meet the level 1 criteria, they needn't fill out the application form. If they're filling mostly level 1s and maybe a couple of level 2s, they're probably going to get a job. If they're filling out a lot of level 2s, they're definitely going to get a job. And if they're filling out a lot of level 3s, then we should have hired them years ago. For trainers who are on the job, and this is a trainer description, this is not a teacher description. We have a teacher description, but this was based on British Council Teaching Centre teachers, and it's not appropriate to the Indian context. It's more the Indian state school context. It's more appropriate to for internal British Council use. So I've given you the trainer competencies because I thought those would be of more use to you and of more interest to you. I've called them competencies. Skill sets, we've kind of merged the two, and we've had a little bit of an argument before we came on stage about the difference between them, and we're going to clarify later on the difference between those and standards and performance indicators, there's a lot of difference between them. The important thing here, though, is that we have a clear picture of the kind of people we want to come and work with us. This is also useful when we look at the state school sector. We have a clear picture of the kind of people we need to become trainers within that sector, and we can use those criteria as a filtering system for finding talent spotting and finding the people that we need to be able to do the job that we need them to do, and the state needs them to do. We also can use it for professional development purposes, and potentially, though we haven't yet, but we potentially for appraisal purposes, for looking at whether people have actually achieved these levels of competence or not, whether they have developed to the point where we can say, yes, you can do that now. I think that's all I'm going to say at the moment, in that we've developed a tool for doing this. We have a clear picture and a description of what people are able to do, and we can use it in a number of different ways in their professional lives and for our institutional purposes. And I think I'd like to pass it on to the next speaker.
At some point, I think one of us here should respond to the word outcomes, measurable outcomes. Yeah, measurable outcomes, as opposed to intangible gains, perhaps, right? Is that worth measuring at all?
Yes.
Yeah. So at some point, I think a couple of our colleagues would like you to respond to that later. Right.
Do you want to respond to that, Jane?
If you want to do it straight away, yeah.
Forgive me if I take up the baton here. There are different kinds of outcomes. You may have a learning outcome. Alan has described competencies. Competencies and the assessment of those competencies would tell you whether you've achieved a learning outcome. Is the teacher able to engage the students in undertaking action learning? An outcome would be that, yes, the teacher is able to instruct their students in how to take an action learning approach. That's a learning outcome. An implementation or performance outcome is a teacher actually doing that on a day-to-day basis as a matter of practice to the level of standard that you expect. There's a huge difference, this picks up, which I hope we will pick up again later, on this difference between can somebody do something and do they actually do that to a standard on a frequent and regular basis. So two different kinds of outcomes. An earlier outcome that you also should be checking is, do they believe this is the right way to do things? Are they actually motivated and engaged on the journey of improving their practice? That's a very different, what we call an engagement outcome. So we need an outcome or set of outcome data that tells us whether people are engaged, whether they have learned, whether they are now doing, and ultimately, is the result of that, the impact outcome, showing in the results in the classroom, showing in the number of students that go forward to achieve higher grades or have mobility in improving what they do. So different kinds of outcomes. And we need to understand they're very different and they tell us different things. If I can just bring up the word intangible, as Paul, you have asked about that. We have a very specific, in our methodology, we have a very specific way of defining tangible and intangible. If you're going to report outcomes, you must have data. Whether those outcomes are data items that you can put a money value on, or whether they are data items that you cannot put a money value on. Our definition, and I accept it's not everybody's, is that tangible and intangible data items are either ones that you can put an economic value on or ones you can't. Outcomes that you have not measured don't exist. Anecdote is anecdote. An odd story is an odd story. It is not data. I think I'll leave it at that.
Did anybody have any other questions before we move on to the next speaker? There's one in the middle at the back there.
I'm Anil Sarwal from DAV College, Chandigarh. I think the thing that you said is very pertinent. First, can somebody do something or test something? And does he actually do that? I think the whole enigma, the whole confusion in India, in CCE especially, is that whether teachers are trained, and even if they are trained, whether they are applying the criteria and whether they are testing it accurately.
And let's clarify that. Can somebody do it? So, you've got a teacher on a training course. You're getting them to do something like get students into pairs so that they can do pair work in a number of different ways. And they may well demonstrate on the course that they can do that. Whether they go back to their classroom in their school in the middle of rural Punjab and actually do that is an entirely different thing. So we need to have ways of finding out whether, after our training courses, when our teachers go back to their classrooms, whether they're actually putting the results of the training into practice on a day-to-day basis. Now, you may send an observer out there and they may go into the classroom, which of course the teacher has been preparing for all week because they know they're coming to come and see them, and you might see a model lesson, which is invariably something the teacher has prepared the kids for, enabled them to do, and practiced several times before the observer gets there, and that's problematic. That isn't still, they can do it, but we still don't know, do they do it? And one of the challenges is, how do we know that they're doing these kinds of things on a regular basis? And I would argue that the only way to deal with that is on a whole school management basis, on getting somebody who's there on a regular basis to be able to walk past classrooms and see whether things are happening on the ground as they should be. But that involves a whole other level of training for people like school supervisors, department heads, other teachers who can report on whether this is happening or not. And it also brings up the issue of policing classrooms or policing schools, and that can be very sensitive. And so there's a whole raft of issues there that need to be teased apart to figure out how we can actually work out the difference between can and do on a regular basis. Any other questions?
I am Rashid Nehal, teaching English at AMU Aligarh. I have a question to Ellen. In the context of training needs analysis, there have been issues such as the dichotomy between the organizational needs and the individual teacher needs.
The organizational needs and what?
Individual teacher needs.
Individual teacher
right,
needs. Okay.
For purpose of teaching. And I would like to know from you that what is the status of organizational needs analysis in the context of English language teaching?
Well, I can tell you generally from a state point of view, individual teacher needs are not taken into consideration. It's the needs of the organization are paramount and teachers are expected to meet them. The target is set there. There's a training course that everybody has to go through, and that's the aim of that course, is to get everybody to that level. Some people may be closer to those, being able to achieve those outcomes than others, but the individual teacher needs generally are not thought about. That is different in certain states, but very few and far between. Within the training course, and it's usually the way that individual needs are dealt with, is through the training course and the interaction of the master trainer with the trainers in training. That's how individual needs are dealt with. So we have the general learning outcomes, and then our training consultant deals with individual trainer needs and helps them with whatever they have to do. But I don't think it's taken into account generally on an organizational basis by state governments at the moment. There are certain states that are particularly interested in CPD frameworks, for example, continuous professional development frameworks that could be tailored more to the individual and have more to do with individual teacher choice. But as far as I can see, generally across the state systems in India, there's very little individual teacher choice built into development processes. That may well be different in the private sector, but certainly within the state school sector, there's not much there. Can I pass this on to Marianne? We will take more questions later, but let's keep the discussion moving on and getting a bit deeper down into the nitty-gritty, which I think our next two speakers are going to deal with.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm going to get down into the nitty-gritty of opening that black box of the classroom, and I'm going to look at evaluating teacher performance very much from a developmental angle. I think Jane looked at what we should evaluate, but I'm going to think about why we should evaluate for developmental purposes and just talk a little bit about some maybe slightly different ways of doing it to offer some thoughts for discussion. So I call it the black box of the classroom. Many of you will know this term in the literature because I find it interesting that even for developmental purposes, some teachers really don't want to open that black box to others. And I know when I myself was teaching, sometimes I felt quite threatened by people coming in, observing me. I think it's quite a natural feeling. And this might be the case even when teachers can showcase a lesson. And I think both Alan and Jane have talked about the fact that as teachers, we can often show that we do things, but we don't necessarily do this on an everyday basis. And we don't necessarily critically reflect on our practice. So firstly, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the role of what I'll call the mentor or the teacher educator, the person working with the teacher. I think this role is crucial, and it's really important to build up trust. Now, this may not be possible, but in my experience, if the teacher can choose who they work with, that's a great advantage. I think it's important too, as Alan said, that the process is ongoing. This is it's not a one-off conversation or a one-off observation, and that it starts from where the teacher is and goes at a pace with which the teacher is comfortable. I think it's really important too, and this links again to both what Jane and Alan were saying, that there is a focus for evaluation, and competencies are a good starting point for a focus. They provide a framework, if you like, against which teachers and the people who are working with them can evaluate practice. So, how can we do this? Well, for me, the whole purpose of this process is to start a dialogue between two professionals, which also leads to reflection. And there are a number of ways that we can use to start this dialogue that do include classroom observation, but also there are other ways of doing it differently. One thing you can do is actually just talk through a competency with the teacher. Competencies usually pivot on beliefs and values, and these may not be beliefs and values that the teacher shares. So talking through these competencies, what they really mean, what they look like in the classroom, can be very useful and non-threatening. Another thing you can do is talk with the teacher about his or her students. So, for example, if one of the competencies might be the teacher knows how students learn and knows how to ensure all students can access the curriculum, If the teacher then talks about her students, talks about how they're individual, how they're different, and perhaps how they learn differently, this can be a good starting point for changing practice in the class. You can also get the teacher to bring in old or new lesson plans and talk them through the lens of a competency. You can also get the teacher to keep some kind of reflective journal. I'm sure many of you have done this yourselves or get your students to do this. In these journals, teachers can write down questions that they have had in class about how they should manage the class or how they should respond. Then they can discuss these questions with you. The outcome of all these tools is dialogue, and I think that's what's important. The beauty of them is they're effective, but also they build up trust amongst the two people engaged in this process. Trust which can then maybe lead to some form of classroom observation. This doesn't have to be live classroom observation. Both teacher and mentor can actually watch the class afterwards if videoing is possible. This means they can reflect together on what they see. A few tips for observation. Once again, I think there should be pre-observation dialogue and, of course, post-observation dialogue, but also the observer should have some kind of a role in collecting evidence, and this is where research methods come in. A teacher with an objective role can then discuss more objectively what's happened in the class, and it will be less threatening for the teacher. I also think it's really important that after the observation, when the teacher and the mentor are perhaps discussing the lesson, that the teacher's practice, what she or he is doing, is affirmed or celebrated where it's been done well. I think developing teachers is not just about finding weaknesses, it's also about celebrating what they're doing well. When you do look at areas for improvement too, it's good to offer a number of different suggestions. And it's up to the teacher what they take on board. They may want to try out different interventions, or they may want to reject them completely. Sometimes teachers also need time to digest what they're hearing from you or hearing from themselves. So, a few sort of tips and tools really for discussion before we hand over to Sue. So I don't know if there are any questions at this moment. I think we've got one.
There's a mic over there. There's somebody with a mic over there.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hello.
I'm Sandeep Kumar from district Pathankot, Punjab. And I do agree with all of you that if we have to achieve something, we have to achieve it. There is no compromise. We cannot say, no, I cannot do that. But my question is based on facts. 3 or 4 facts are there. We received mentor training way back in the month of May. Now, this question will be related afterwards. I spoke this line, we received mentor training in the month of May. India is a federal country. We are having education as a state subject. My point is that the governments keep on changing, and when the governments change, the policies also change. That's the problem. What the previous government thinks and the time when it comes to the practical implementation of those things, 5 years have gone by. And experimentation keeps on going on with this education of India. And basically, India is a multilingual country. There was, you can say, a reorganization of states in India on basis of language also. So the point is, in your system, in Europe, in England, there is consistency in policies. In India, we don't find this thing. That's why when we give our best, or you can say 100%, and in reality, when it comes to the groundwork, the whole scenario changes, sir. So I would like that you should put some stress on this thing. Thank you, sir.
May I? Yeah. I haven't lived in the UK for 23 years. I've lived in Japan for 15, I've lived in Thailand for 6, and I'm now in India over a year and a half. I've visited most of the countries in East Asia, and I can tell you that the situation is exactly the same in most of them. In the UK, governments change also. Policies change dramatically. British Council is needs to change its policies based on the most recent political changes in the UK. That has changed several times since I've worked for the British Council. That is completely outside of our control. And we need to work out how we can deal with those constant changes in political power, but also message to the politicians with a unified voice what kinds of changes we want to see within our education systems. And we need to have the parents on our sides for that, because they are the larger power. They are the people who are voting these people into political power. So my message to you, sir, would be, yes, we acknowledge that, yes, it's difficult, but we just have to accept what we can change, deal with the situation that we're in, and try and message to as many people as possible the positive things that we want to change within the system, so that that eventually gets to the politicians, and hopefully they will think similarly about different educational situations.
Hello. Hello.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, all of you. Me, Vikas. I am from Bihar. I have 2 questions. First of all, I want to clear that what is difference between evaluation and assessment. And second, if you are going to evaluate, how to evaluate, when to evaluate, why to evaluate, and when, what is the process of evaluation? Sorry.
How long have you got? Do you want to do the assessment and evaluation one first? Or shall I do the... You take it. Okay. I'll take the second question, when, why. I think I'll take the why part of the second question. Why should we evaluate? I think there are a number of different reasons, and the perspectives here are coming from slightly different perspectives. So you might be evaluating to make the institution accountable, to make your teachers accountable, to be accountable to parents, funders, etc. Or you might be evaluating, as I talked about, for developmental purposes. You need to be clear why you're evaluating, but also the two one can contribute to the other, and they can also complement each other. So in my case, if you have processes going on in a school, for example, where teachers are regularly getting developmental support, if these are quite robust processes, they can then contribute to perhaps a more formal means of evaluation at an institutional level. And Jane, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I mean, I think I would define the two as evaluation is helping to answer the questions, are we doing the right thing, and are we doing it the right way? I believe assessment is the way we try and find out, particularly in terms of learning outcomes and performance outcomes. The assessment process is providing answers to the questions, are we doing it in the right way? Now, that's a little bit simplistic, but it's the only way I think I can define it in my own terms. I think I'd also like to answer the question as well, to add to Marianne's, about why. I think if we're not prepared to ask the question, why do we know what we are doing achieves what we want to achieve? That's the function of it. It's to ask the question, are we able to find out are we doing what we're doing is achieving what we want it to achieve or not? Now, people who don't want that question answered, and there are many of them, are often people, if I may pick up on something Alan said earlier, who say, I've got a budget to spend, it's at the end of December, I have to get rid of the budget before it all ends. As long as I can show I've got rid of it, that's all that matters. But remember, that's our money. That's your money. That's our money. That's not the way we would like to see our organizations run, nor is it, I'm assuming, the way we want to see the way our world is run.
Marianne, hi.
Sorry,
my name is...
Just a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
She had her hand up first.
Thank you, panelists, for raising up very valid issues. I had a point in mind. In the multilingual context that we have across the country, I think the word intervention needs to be looked into and worked upon. In fact, when our teachers really work with evaluation in their classroom levels or in the institutes, the strengths and weaknesses get mingled. And they perhaps do not know where to build up on the strengths. So what I was thinking is, could we talk about training them on monitoring their work, their own work, peer monitoring, and maybe monitoring their own situations about how the competencies that they themselves reflect upon as a result for the students really work out. Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think teachers getting together at a school level or teacher trainers at a college level, working together, doing peer observation, having this professional dialogue is very, very valuable and can really move teachers forward. I'd just like to answer the question from the lady up the front here who's been waiting since the beginning.
My question is related to the pre-observation dialogue and the post-observation dialogue. We recently went through a mentoring workshop and we are observing teachers who are teaching. I'm a part of the Teach India project from Times of India. So I wanted to understand what is the pre-observation discussion. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important to have the pre-observation dialogue, and what it would consist of is the observer maybe talking a little bit about the class, and the teacher having the chance to describe the class, describe any students that maybe are more problematic than others, to talk through the lesson, but also maybe to find that focus for what they want the observer to do, to talk about if it is linked to a competency, to talk about that, and also to give the observer some kind of role. You can use pro formas for observation, but sometimes they can be quite threatening. So having a role which is more objective, ticking boxes. So if you wanted to look at who the teacher talks to in a class, you can have the observer draw some kind of a diagram to see where the questions go to. And that gives you some evidence and some starting point for discussion. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'll now hand over to Sue.
Thank you. Hi everybody, last but not least. It's a pleasure to be here and have the chance to talk to you. I've been learning a lot about your context and how things operate in India in the last couple of days. I come from a rather different context. I come from Ireland, and our whole population is 4 million. So you can understand that some of the large-scale issues that you may have are not perhaps issues that we have. I would, however, like to say to the gentleman over there who talked about, perhaps touched on the frustrations of policymakers at government level and politicians, that you could have been an Irish teacher talking to us about 2 weeks ago. It was almost verbatim. believe me, as Alan said as well, you are certainly not alone in encountering those kind of frustrations, which are, of course, to some extent, to a great extent, perhaps, outside your control. I just want to tell you a bit about what we do in Ireland. I work for the quality assurance body, looking at setting standards, for benchmark standards for language teaching and learning across both the public and the private sector. There isn't any distinction made. And part of our, and of course, evaluation is all about quality, whatever that means, that very abstract word that gets bounced around a lot. As Jane has said here, it's about accountability, it's about, if you like, quality control, the sort of hardcore end. It's also about quality enhancement. Perhaps that's the more creative and engaging end of evaluation. In the same way that evaluation tells you whether something is working or not, it can also tell you why it's not working and what you could do further to improve and, if you like, find a solution or find alternatives. That's number one. In our quality assurance scheme, we asked schools not to evaluate teacher performance, but to evaluate teaching performance. So as the external quality assurance body, we ask schools, using very similar methodology as Alan has talked about, with a profiling grid for teacher competences, we ask schools to sit down with their teaching team and draw up a profile of that team. No names are mentioned. It's not about pointing the finger at any particular individual. What we want to know is how the teaching team is described. We then, when we go into the school, we see if that evaluation, if you like, that internal evaluation matches our external evaluation. And obviously, the closer it matches, the more aware, perhaps, one can consider the school to be. The less it matches, obviously, the difference. We set benchmark standards, but we want to see that the school has a plan for improvement. Teaching is obviously the core activity. So how is that managed? How is it continually being looked at in a process for improvement? One of the ways we've done that recently is to ask the school, to ask the academic team, particularly the core team of teachers and perhaps academic support management, to actually identify in an ideal world if those constraints that we all cope with on a day-to-day basis weren't there, what they would like the school to be doing, what they would like to be doing, able to do in terms of the teaching. We then, once they've set out that vision, we ask them to describe the reality. And the school improvement plan is the gap in between, if you like. What's particularly important in that is that teachers are involved right from the beginning. Evaluation isn't something that's dropped on them from a height by some anonymous external person. It is in the hands of the teaching team. I think that's extremely important. If there isn't ownership of where they are, where they want to go in terms of standards, and then indeed how they're going to get there, it's just not going to happen. Or it's going to happen in a somewhat compromised and fragmented fashion. So that would be kind of my first point. My second point, and I'm ranging all over the place a bit here, I had a feeling I might, is that evaluation must have a purpose. And that purpose must be clear to everybody who's involved in that process. If it's purposeless, or if all the stakeholders don't agree and buy into that purpose, it's going to be a rather negative and possibly very counterproductive exercise, which is simply going to perhaps inculcate that feeling of lack of trust, anxiety, feeling of low worth, etc., low self-esteem. It may also impact on the data that is actually generated, i.e. it will be possibly not very meaningful. We've talked about the sort of pay and display type of evaluation that you get in training courses, and then that conundrum of knowing that somebody, a teacher or a teaching team, has the capacity to do it, but do they do it all the time? What kind of systems and processes can you embed into your school system internally to ensure that the support and the mechanisms are there, the processes are there to enable teachers to be working at their optimum capacity, to their optimum level, and that teachers have an understanding of where they are professionally on the professional pathway, let's say, and how they can progress along that pathway with the help of the organization that they work for. That idea of policing classrooms is, of course, anathema to all of us, I'm sure, in here, and certainly not something that we would want to promote, or an idea that we would see as being at all a very positive one. That is definitely a road to absolute chaos from any quality point of view. Teaching, Jane referred to opening the black box. Teaching is by nature a rather isolated activity. It is, of course, very threatening to have people coming in and observing you and commenting, and particularly if that sort of evaluation has a certain pragmatic value. Again, I'll come back to the point I was discussing with some colleagues earlier, that you can only have a culture of evaluation for developmental purposes in an organization which has a learning culture. If the conditions aren't there within the organization to foster this type of practice, then it's not going to work. I was going to talk a bit about reflective practice and Wallace's model, looking at experiential learning, critical friends, classroom, micro-classroom research. I went to a very good workshop this morning by Maya Menon. Is Maya here? Is she here? Oh, she's over in the corner there. I was going to talk a bit about it, but she gave an excellent workshop, and I would like to refer you to her to talk about examples of very practical and successful practice in your context. What I saw this morning was extremely stimulating, very interesting, and very proactive and practical, feasible. So, Maya, I'm handing the baton to you for that. Maya will be on the panel on Monday. Okay, so you'll get a chance to talk to her then.
Yeah. Would anyone like to? Yes, please.
I'm Manik from Sri Lanka. And let me share some experience that I had with my student teachers at the Teachers College in Kandy. I'm a teacher educator myself, and this training the teachers, just having 5 spells during the 2 residential years was a big task for us. It was a challenge. But I got a training from the British Council once about this peer observation, and I really gained benefits from that. More than me, it was my students who spoke about it. And I thought of doing a research on it, action research, on reflective peer observation. As she said, this pre-discussion of the lesson and the post-discussion of the lesson, and my intervention was very limited. I just got the students to speak about each other's performance, and within 10 days, I was able to take them up to a very good standard. Thank you very much. And this is real experience.
Yeah. Basically, that
Hello.
is common, so that's it.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. I have a question. We have been training at Karnataka State for the first time from the British Council to teachers, and I'm working as a trainer at the Karnataka State government. When training teachers, we found that it was so motivating experiences and they would enjoy in the training. Going back to the classes, we had interaction with the teachers, and we got to know that majority of the teachers are not English teachers. They teach other subjects. And there is a dearth of gaining confidence in them, and especially they have a time limitation of 40 minutes. So in 40 minutes, they are not able to give a quality teaching. Once they go back to their schools, they are hecked up with so much of other responsibilities and other content. It's highly difficult for them to teach English in a creative way. So how could you suggest me some things which I can guide them where they can teach English, or where we can assist them in a more qualitative way? Have I made it clear?
Let me paraphrase it back to you and let me find out if I've got it right or not. You're saying that teachers have so many different constraints on them that they have difficulty putting what they learn on training courses into practice on the ground.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not at all surprised, yes. They have multiple functions in India. They're responsible for running state elections and for running census and for doing administrative stuff and for making the school dinners, for
yeah, that is the other part of the story,
all that kind of stuff.
That is the other part. But here we have teachers, less number of teachers teaching more subjects. Apart from English, they teach other subjects, and they are not well focused, or they don't have the compatibility to English much. So
yes.
that was my concern.
Yeah, you're quite right. I think think that putting subject teachers, sorry, there's no point in waving at me because I don't have a mic. You have to wave at somebody who has a mic on the floor. You keep waving at me. It's very distracting. Sorry. Subject teachers who are given English classes to teach, it's a crying shame. If you haven't had any form of training or any form of educational background in how to teach language, you shouldn't be teaching language. There should be at least some kind of basic course that everybody has to teach before they get into a language classroom, because teaching English is not the same as teaching history. Yeah? Teaching social studies is not the same as teaching a language. And just because the subject teachers have high levels of English ability does not mean that they're able to teach an English class. My sister has very high levels of English ability, but I would not put her in front of a class of 30 Indian kids and tell her to teach them something. It doesn't make any sense. So until we get the message to the people who can make a difference about this, nothing's going to change, unfortunately, but we really should be messaging this to the politicians and the people who are running the education systems to try and ensure that there's some kind of preparation for subject teachers before they go into the English language class. Was that what you wanted me to say?
Sir, we have given such good training, and when it goes waste at the grassroots level, it is really we feel sad for it. And please forward this message, it would be helping us.
Excuse me.
Can I ask a question? Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chopon from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. So my question would be to Marianne. You have mentioned that if the outcomes of the training program are non-tangible, then these are not data. These are not outcomes. But nowadays we are more concerned with the teachers' belief system, how to change this belief system, how to go about reflection, and we are more concerned with teachers' values, how to change these values. But are these kind of change is immediately tangible? And how to capture it? And what is the time frame or time limit to capture or to assess and come to conclusion and say, okay, this course has worked or has not worked? And isn't it unfair to judge immediately? And for example, in this case, in teacher education, we cannot use Donald Kirkpatrick's 4-level evaluation, right? We cannot go to the schools or to program centers and, for example, 3 months later and again assess and go back and do that. So what is the, at the same time, for example, sometimes teachers, we teacher trainers or teacher educators, we notice some changes in terms of practices, tactics. But at the same time, it might be superficial, right? They can't just, they can just pick up certain tactics, certain activities and using without knowing rationale behind. So how can we tackle this problem?
Okay, if I can just tackle the first bit of your question. I think if I understood it correctly, I think there is a little bit of tension between what Jane was talking about in terms of intangible outcomes and what I was talking about in terms of reflection. Am I right?
My question was to her, maybe.
Yeah. Well, for that bit of the question, you're absolutely right. There is a little bit of tension, as there is between why heads or deans of university or heads or principals of schools want to conduct evaluations and why teachers or teacher trainers want to conduct evaluations. That tension will always be there, I think. But just to answer your question briefly, Alan was talking about competencies. I often use the word standards. One of the standards for me that is essential for a teacher is the ability to be able to reflect. So in a sense, that meets both sides. I don't know if Jane wants to add to that. Oh.
Sorry about that. Right.
Excuse me.
Thank you very much. We've... Sure.
Excuse me, sir.
Jane, sorry.
Oh,
you do that.
Sorry, there's a man at the back or somebody at the back flashing a card saying finish, finish, finish. So we're all not anxious to have you run over on your time. I'd just like to say, firstly, in terms of intangibles and tangibles, it's a complex topic, and I'm very happy to talk to you offline about what we mean by tangibles and intangibles. I do want to make one single point, and that is there is a difference, as we've all, I think, from the nodding and the agreement, we've all said there's a difference between knowing whether teachers can do something and whether they actually do it. That isn't necessarily a question of their fault, it is often the conditions. I would argue, back to my very first point, if when you start a project, you have a proper evaluation program in place with clear outcome indicators for everything that you wish to understand, as not just do they know it, but are they doing it, then you are going to be able to report proper data which we can take back to those policymakers to say, you've just spent a bunch of money, but the conditions do not allow us to get any value from it because you weren't prepared to understand we can't just change one thing, we have to change a lot of things to make this work. That's what a good evaluation will give you.
Thank you very much. Could you give the panel a round of applause, please? Yeah.